She never even lifted her foot off the accelerator. That's what gets me every time I think back to those first few weeks. Not the dust cloud she left hanging over the pasture for 10 minutes after she passed. Not the way my horses would slam back against the fence line every single time she came through. Not even the way my youngest started flinching at the sound of a car engine while she was trying to eat breakfast. What gets me is that she never once, not a single time, even considered slowing down. She had somewhere to be, and my farm was just the fastest way to get there. My feelings about it, my animals, my children, my property, none of it registered as something worth a 2-second tap of the brake pedal. That's the kind of person we're dealing with. But I want you to know something. By the time this story ends, she slowed down permanently. She slowed down because she had no other choice. And the thing that stopped her was already buried in the dirt waiting for her before she even knew a conversation had started. Let me take you back to the beginning. I've been on this land for 11 years. Before that, my grandfather worked it for 30. 43 acres of mixed pasture and creek bottom in the hill country of central Tennessee. Far enough from the interstate that you can actually hear the night when it gets quiet. I run a small operation. A few dozen beef cattle, 2 horses my daughters have grown up riding, chickens, a kitchen garden, and the kind of bone-deep daily routine that only makes sense to people who have chosen this life on purpose. The road that connects my farm to the main highway is a private easement, about a quarter mile of packed dirt and gravel running through a corridor of old cedar and hackberry. It has been there since my grandfather's time. For most of its existence, the people who used it treated it the way you treat a road that belongs to someone else. Slowly, carefully, with a small wave if they passed you walking it. My neighbor Dale, who runs 50 head on the parcel east of mine, has used that road for 20 years, and I have never once had a crossword with him about it. His wife brings jam at Christmas. Their grandchildren fish the creek in summer. That's what a shared easement is supposed to look like. Then the subdivision went in 2 miles west, and everything changed. The development was called Creekside Crossing, which is the kind of name that sounds invented by someone who has never actually lived near a creek. 64 houses on formerly agricultural land, a community mailbox cluster, a playground with rubberized mulch, and an HOA that formed before the paint was dry on the model home. The people who moved in were mostly fine. Commuters, young families, people who wanted more square footage than the city could offer at that price point. Most of them drove past my fence line respectfully, and we never had any reason to interact at all. And then there was Vanessa. Vanessa Crowell was the HOA president, self-elected to the role in the way that people who want that kind of power always manage to acquire it, by being the only person in the room who visibly wanted it. She drove a charcoal gray SUV that she handled like a rally car, dressed like she was perpetually on her way to a meeting she was already late for, and operated with the unshakable confidence of someone who has never once had to reckon with consequences. The first time I saw her on my road, I was repairing a section of fence line about 50 yards from the gate. She came through so fast that the initial thing I registered wasn't her vehicle. It was the dust cloud which hit me about 3 seconds after she was already gone. The way thunder follows lightning. I stood there in a brown haze, one hand still holding a fence staple, and processed what had just happened. The second time, I was standing directly in the road when she came over the rise. I had to step sideways to avoid being clipped. She slowed marginally, gave me what I can only describe as an administrative look, the expression of someone acknowledging an obstacle on a to-do list, and kept moving. The third time, my mare, Clementine, threw herself against the pasture fence hard enough to leave a mark on her chest that took 2 weeks to heal. The vet bill was $90. I mention that not because of the money, but because of the moment I stood in the barn that evening watching Clementine favor her left shoulder, and I understood that this was not going to resolve itself. I tried the reasonable path first. I always do. I drove to Creekside Crossing, found Vanessa's house, knocked on the door, and introduced myself in the most non-confrontational tone I could manage. I explained the easement, the speed, the animals, the children playing in the yard. I was polite. I was specific. I offered to put a speed limit sign at the entrance that would apply to everyone. I gave her every opportunity to simply say she hadn't realized the impact and would do better. She told me the road was the most convenient route to the highway, and that if I wanted less dust I should consider whether the road's surface was adequate. Then she closed the door. I put up signs anyway, hand-painted on cedar boards staked every 50 feet. Private road, slow down. Children and animals present. I spent a Saturday afternoon on those signs. By Wednesday, 3 of them had been knocked over, and one had been driven over so thoroughly that it was pressed flat into the gravel like a piece of roadkill. I called the county sheriff's office. A deputy came out, took the information, spoke with Vanessa, and called me afterward to explain. In the measured tone of a man who has delivered this particular explanation before, that a private easement exists outside most traffic enforcement jurisdiction. Speeding on private property is, in the technical legal sense, a civil matter. He said I could document everything and pursue it in civil court, a process he estimated would take the better part of a year and cost me more in legal fees than I was going to recover in damages. I thanked him. I hung up. I went out to the barn and watched Clementine for a while. There is a particular frustration that comes with being entirely correct about something and completely powerless to act on it through official channels. I have a right to have my private road driven on respectfully. I can prove that right in writing. And a woman in a charcoal SUV is blowing through it twice a day, and there is nothing in the legal architecture available to me in the short term that will make her stop before my horse gets seriously injured or one of my girls gets hurt running out to the gate. That is the frustration that takes a person from the porch to the barn to the old equipment storage in the back corner where my grandfather's tools have been rusting peacefully for 30 years. I wasn't looking for anything specific that afternoon. I was moving boxes, mostly. Reorganizing, the kind of physical work you do when your brain needs to be occupied and your hands need something to hold. I found the box in the back corner under a canvas tarp, exactly where it had been sitting since before I took ownership of the property. Inside was a collection of farm hardware from another era, heavy cast iron pieces, rusted chain, a pair of old cultivator shanks, and near the bottom, a set of thick metal strips with a serrated edge profile. They were originally part of a harrow attachment designed to break apart compacted soil by dragging across it. Each strip was about 18 inches long, heavy-gauge steel, with ridges along one face that were not quite sharp enough to cut but absolutely sufficient to bite into something with force if it hit them right. I held one of them in both hands and stood in the dusty light of the barn for a long time. I want to be clear about what I was and was not willing to do. I was not willing to create a genuine safety hazard. I was not interested in anyone getting hurt. I was not trying to cause a collision or flip a vehicle or injure a person. Those outcomes serve no one, least of all me. What I was thinking about was consequence. Vanessa had been absorbing zero consequence for her behavior. Every approach that should have produced friction, my conversation, the signs, the sheriff's visit, had produced none. She had simply continued and if anything seemed to treat the resistance as confirmation that the road was hers to use however she wanted. What I needed was a mechanism that would introduce physical, immediate, unavoidable consequence for high-speed travel on my road. Something that would not harm the driver but would absolutely conclusively ruin the experience of driving fast. Something that was already part of the soil, invisible from the seat of a moving vehicle, and left no traceable evidence except 2 flat tires and a very long wait for a tow truck. I went to the hardware store and bought 4 8-foot pressure-treated 2x6s, a box of 3-inch deck screws, and 2 pounds of 4-inch structural screws with wide flange heads. I spent an evening in the shop building what I needed. The concept was not complicated. Drive screws through the plank from the back face until the points protrude an inch from the front. Space them 4 inches apart in a staggered pattern across the full width. Not enough to cause a blowout at low speed. The pressure on a slow-rolling tire would simply ride over the blunt shank. But at high speed, the kinetic energy multiplies. At 30-40 miles per hour on a dirt road, hitting a row of upward-pointing screw tips is a very different experience than rolling over them at a walking pace. I built 4 planks. I stacked them in the barn and waited for the right night. 3 nights later, conditions were ideal. Overcast, no moon worth mentioning. Dry enough that the soil would cooperate. I took my shovel and a wheelbarrow down to the road after 11 o'clock. I had watched Vanessa's pattern carefully over the previous 2 weeks. She always hit the same line. Drivers do this naturally on familiar roads. The brain finds the smoothest path, and the hands follow it automatically. She tracked slightly right of center on the uphill approach from the subdivision end, then drifted toward the left crown as she crested the low rise about 140 yards in. That rise was where I dug. I cut 4 shallow trenches across the road's width, each about 4 inches deep, spaced 18 inches apart. I laid the planks face down, screw points upward, flush with the bottom of the trench. I refilled each trench with the excavated soil, tamped it lightly, raked it smooth. I walked the road twice with my headlamp and examined each section from multiple angles. You could not see a thing. The surface looked exactly as it always had, a slightly uneven stretch of packed dirt and gravel near the top of the rise, unremarkable, ordinary, the same road she had been driving for months. I put the shovel in the wheelbarrow. I walked back to the house. I washed my hands. I slept better than I had in weeks. The next morning I made coffee earlier than usual. I brought it out to the porch rocker where I can see the road all the way to the cedar line at the property entrance. The pasture was still in that gray pre-dawn state where everything looks like a pencil sketch of itself. Clementine was at the far end of the field, tail moving slow. My younger daughter's bicycle was leaning against the porch rail where she'd left it the night before. I drank my coffee, I waited. She came at 8:22. I heard the engine before I saw the vehicle, that particular high RPM note she always carried when she came through. The sound of a motor being pushed on unpaved road because the driver has decided that the condition of the surface is someone else's problem. She cleared the cedar line at speed, dust already lifting behind her, and hit the rise. The sound reached me about a half second after it happened. A hard, sharp report once, then twice in rapid sequence, like two books being slapped flat on a table. Then the distinctive hiss of pressure releasing fast. The SUV broke sideways across the road, corrected and ground to a halt in a cloud of red dust and displaced gravel about 60 yards past the crest. I set my coffee mug on the porch rail. I stood up, I walked down the drive at the pace of a man with nowhere in particular to be. Vanessa was out of the vehicle by the time I reached her. Both front tires were flat, not slowly deflating flat, riding on rim, with the flanged screw heads visible along the inner sidewall of the nearest tire like a row of small steel teeth. She was standing in the road in her work clothes, phone already in her hand, her face cycling through emotions faster than I could track them. The dust was still settling. I stopped a few feet away and looked at the tires the way a man looks at something he has never seen before. I tilted my head slightly. I said, "You all right?" She pointed at the tires and then at me. "You did this? Looks like you picked up something in the road," I said. "I've been meaning to grade this section. It's hard to keep up with when there's a lot of traffic." I paused. "You were moving pretty quick coming over that rise. On an unpaved road, you really want to watch your speed." I let that sit for a moment. "Glad you weren't going faster. That could have gotten serious." She knew. I could see it in her face the moment the calculation ran, and she understood that there was no version of this she could take anywhere useful. She could say I sabotaged her road, and I would ask what she meant by her road. She could call the sheriff, and I would show the deputy where I had been repeatedly waving down an unauthorized high-speed driver on my private easement and asking her respectfully to slow down. She could dig up the road looking for evidence, and she would find screws in a plank which any competent attorney would note she could not definitively link to me on a road on my property that she was driving on without express permission, at speeds I had formally requested she not drive. The tow truck took 2 hours to arrive. An additional charge applied for the off-road service call. I watched from the porch while they loaded her vehicle onto the flatbed before she got into the cab of the tow truck. Vanessa looked back at me once, standing at the gate at the end of my driveway with my hands in my pockets. I gave her a small nod, neighborly, civil. She got in the truck. She didn't look back again. She never used my road after that. Not once, not at any speed. The charcoal SUV stopped appearing at the cedar line entirely. She took the longer public route, the one that added 4 minutes to her commute, and she took it every single day from that point forward. The dust settled, literally. Within a week the road looked like it had before any of this started. The horses relaxed. My daughters went back to playing in the yard without that low-level tension that had been building in all of us without anyone acknowledging it. The morning quiet came back, that specific mountain country stillness that is the whole reason a person chooses this life. I refilled the trenches properly a few days later, packed them tight, graded the section smooth, put down a layer of road base. The road is in better shape now than it was before any of this started. I also did something else. I called a property attorney in town and had the easement formally documented with the county. The terms of use, the speed conditions, the list of permitted users and vehicles. It had existed informally for a long time, the way a lot of rural easements do, and this situation had taught me that informal arrangements depend entirely on the goodwill of everyone involved, and goodwill is not something you can count on from a stranger. The documentation is filed now. If someone uses my road in a way that creates liability, I have a paper record. If someone gets hurt because they were driving recklessly on a private easement with documented speed conditions, my position is clear and my family is protected. I thought about Vanessa for a while after it was over, not with any particular bitterness. I genuinely don't carry this kind of thing once it's resolved, but I thought about the specific shape of the problem she represents because I think it comes up a lot more than people admit. There is a category of person who treats the absence of immediate consequence as permanent permission. If they speed through your property and nothing happens, they conclude that speeding through your property is acceptable. If they ignore your signs and the signs stay knocked down, they conclude that your signs don't matter. Every time they do the thing and survive without friction, the behavior calcifies a little more, it becomes habit, then it becomes entitlement. And by the time you're trying to address it with conversation, they genuinely cannot understand what you're upset about. From their perspective, they've been doing this for months and nothing bad has happened. Is that a problem now? The answer is that consequence was always appropriate. It was simply absent. And the only way to interrupt that cycle is to introduce consequence that is immediate, physical, and inarguably connected to the behavior itself. Not a fine that gets contested, not a letter that gets ignored, not a sheriff's deputy who can't enforce traffic law on a private road. Something that happens the instant the behavior occurs and makes itself perfectly clear. 2 flat tires at 8:22 in the morning on a Tuesday, sitting in the dirt on a road you've been treating like a highway, with a 2-hour wait for a tow truck and an off-road service surcharge, and the knowledge that the person whose property you've been abusing is standing on his porch watching you. That is consequence. Immediate, physical, connected, and entirely self-inflicted. Because the trap doesn't spring at 5 miles per hour. It only springs when you decide that this road, this private road, this road with the signs and the fence and the animals and the children, belongs to you. I want to say one more thing before I close this out, because I know what some of you are thinking. Was it a risk? Yes. I built something that I had to calibrate carefully and think through honestly. I was not willing to create a hazard that could harm a person, and I built it with that constraint as the primary design requirement. The screws don't cause a sudden blowout at safe speeds. They don't deflect a tire in a way that causes loss of control if you're driving at a reasonable pace. They are only a problem if you are driving in a way that is already a problem. The trap and the behavior it targets are proportional to each other. That was important to me. It matters that I can say, with complete honesty, that at 10 miles per hour nothing happens. The consequence is exclusively a function of the recklessness. But beyond the engineering of it, there's something I want every person in this situation to understand. You have the right to protect your property. You have the right to use your land in ways that make unauthorized access uncomfortable, inconvenient, and ultimately not worth the effort. You do not have to absorb indefinite damage to your animals, your road, your equipment, and your family's peace of mind while you wait for a legal process to move at its own speed. There are legal, proportionate, documentable ways to make the cost of bad behavior fall on the person doing the behaving. The road is mine. The peace is mine. The quiet mornings with coffee on the porch while Clementine moves across the far pasture and my daughter's bicycles lean against the rail. That's mine too. I didn't ask to defend any of it, but I'm very glad I know how. If you've dealt with a neighbor who treated your private property like a shortcut, a right-of-way they never earned, or a road that belongs to everyone except the person whose name is on the deed, tell me about it in the comments. I've heard from a lot of people in similar situations, and every story is its own specific kind of infuriating. Drop yours below, and if you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time, because next week I'm covering a case where an HOA tried to claim ownership of a man's private well based on a clause buried in a declaration he had never signed. The attorney's letter they sent was 4 pages. His response was 2 words, and it was the correct 2 words. You'll want to see that one. Until then, document everything. Know your property line and remember that the best traps are the ones that only spring when someone deserves them.